All right, welcome to Bold Like a Leopard. And today it's my white privilege to have Mr. Greek Style 1, Swarthy Immigrant. You might know him if you are a follower of Lennon McCarthy, who's also been on the show. And Swarthy, what's up? What's going on? You're from Queens. How's it going over there this
Yeah,
fine Sunday? We're about to be
yes,
doused with snow, but
it's
what about
nice
you
and
guys?
it's a chilly day here, and in honor of the show, I am now calling myself swarthy like a Greek in honor of bold like a leopard. So it's a pleasure to be here. I was a fan. I've watched your shows before, so it's a thrill for me to be on here.
Yeah, it's kind of been it's a strange 3 years since obviously the election, and a lot of people from very different backgrounds seem to find each other. Usually in place. I don't know where you found Lennon, but me and him are both followers of the same show. I write for them sometimes too, the Hard Bastard show. So obviously, due to the censorship of social media and the media itself, a lot of people with very differing views, they're thrown together. So you've been banned on Twitter for how long?
I've been banned for life, and I've been banned on maybe about 30 different times under 30 different names on Twitter. It's a weird thing. I started off Twitter, and I had a few thousand followers before the election. Um, my background, just to give you, my background is in media, and let's put it at that. But I know pretty much all the major players in the media business, in one form or another. And I was sort of semi-retired. A few years ago, my company was sold off, and I got a nice little package. I was going to be a school teacher, and then just as I was about to become a public school history teacher, they wanted me to come back. So I kind of went back in a semi-active role, and in that capacity, I was never on Twitter. To me, Twitter was something 12-year-olds did. You know what I mean? It was a passing thing, like not worth anything in terms of major. So my only Twitter presence was I was talking about comic books and comic book movies because I was a big comic book collector. I stopped collecting about a year or so ago because I couldn't take the wokeness. It just drove me insane. Um, and so my whole thing was I was talking about comic books and whatnot, and then Trump starts running for president, and here I am as a comic book guy, and I was open about the fact that I was an immigrant to the United States. I learned English through reading comic books, etc. It was a non-serious Twitter. I wasn't serious on it. I was just there for laughs and kicks. I thought my audience was the same, but lo and behold, some people noticed because I had a few thousand followers. So we can't have a pro-Trump immigrant uh, actively defending Trump, because Trump said stuff that I wasn't expecting a Republican to say. And at the time, I wasn't a Trump supporter. I was like, per se, I was a Bernie supporter because I like what Bernie said, that open borders was a Koch brothers plan. Is it Koch brothers or Koch brothers? I call them Koch brothers uh, in my Queen's patois.
Well,
And
it's now just a single cock because one of them
yeah,
died. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, keep going.
So the Lord took him too soon, I should say, uh, so that's, I'm like, oh, Bernie's against open borders immigration because unlike most idiots on Twitter, I actually have a memory, an institutional memory of what the Democrats used to stand for and what the Republicans used to stand for and what they stand for now. And the historic stuff I was against. I'm against free trade per se, unless it's reciprocal. I'm okay with free trade existing between two countries where they're actually free trading with each other and that have similar legal and ethical backgrounds. In other words, if I go to court in the EU per se, not all countries in the EU, Greece, I'm sure not, but France, Germany, the United Kingdom, I think I have a pretty good fair chance, like in America, of resolving a trade dispute. Even though the Europeans cheat us like crazy, because I've exported, I should say, stuff to Greece and for my own personal house there. and the taxes are insane because there's certain stuff in Greece that you can't easily get cheap. So I would import stuff here that's used. Like I have I'm going to Greece for 3 months on vacation, and I want to bring some of the stuff that I'm not using in the house to Greece. It arrives at the dock, and they hit me with a 50% tariff on stuff like that. I mean, used TVs, coffee machines, shit like that. Um, uh, so I know firsthand that there is no free trade with the EU, and so the EU is not a equitable. So Trump is the one that's talking about the EU not being equitable. Something Democrats have been talking about all my life. Um, uh, Democrats were the ones against open borders because it imports free, cheap labor. Some parts of the Democratic Party wanted to bring in more people of their own ethnic stripe. But I know for a fact my parents had a hard time becoming citizens, not because they couldn't speak English or pass the test. It's because in the United States you had the unions, and the unions didn't like foreigners with skills coming in and undermining their union membership. So that was another thing. And I only became it was easy enough for me to become an American citizen. I grew up in the United States and whatever. So when it was time for the test, they had no way. I mean, no matter what screwball questions they threw my way, and they did. This was during the Clinton administration. They threw like these questions somebody with a college degree would have a hard time answering regarding the United States government, like naming an obscure amendment or something. But I was going to be a history teacher, so I knew this, like off the top of my head. So there was no way they could fail me. But my parents, when they went to take the test, they almost failed the test because the first question they asked him was, what do you do for a living? And apparently there must be some sort of cheat sheet out there that if you were an immigrant with certain skills, the union didn't want you to become an American citizen. Per the Democratic Party, they would stop you. So I had all this institutional background in my head when Trump started running for president, and I gave Trump an even chance. I was like, you know what? Trump is not as bad as the Democrats are saying. I'm not a Democrat. I voted for Obama, but I'm not a Democrat. And as soon as I started saying stuff like that, boy, was I hit with I don't know what we called them about back in 2015 and 16, like Hillary bots or whatever. But I was attacked to the point where because I kept my identity secret, there was attempts to dox me.
Oh,
Like
correct.
real,
CTR people, the correct the record people.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Share Blue. I was the first to reveal several years ago. I mean, I wish I was able to point to it so I can show you that I'm not making this up, but all my Twitter data is gone. But I was the first to talk about Share Blue or some sort of democratic operation working with Twitter to get people banned. In other words, they would report on accounts to Twitter saying you should remove these people. They're bots or they're fakes or they're Russians or whatever. And I was reporting this because I had insider knowledge. I know the people who make these how mailing lists exist and they sell mailing lists for catalogs and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
They exist for the internet as well. And I know people, since I'm in marketing, I know people like that. And some of them knew who I was, and I would get a call from a friend of mine and go, "Hey, Swarthy, are you the Swarthy that they're attacking?" I'm not using my real name. "Are you the Swarthy they're attacking?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what's happening?" "Well, there's your name is on these lists to be banned. Like we have to ban you, but just keep your heads up, do this and that to not get banned." And it worked a little bit, but it got to the point where no matter what I did, I kept getting banned. Even if I used it got to the point where Twitter banned everyone. If you go online and you look up Swarthy banned, you see a lot of people that are not me, but had the name Swarthy in their name got banned because Twitter banned anybody with the name Swarthy or Greek in it, or some sort of combination thereof. That's how not because I was a threat or anything. It was a computer program that did it. It's not like somebody is hunting you down on Twitter and there's an office space there. It was just the algorithm is geared to getting people like me who have a pro-Trump or Trump-friendly position banned from the discussion. And I'm banned from Facebook too. I had a Swarthy Facebook account that got deleted as well. So the only place I can literally speak freely is on Gab, and that's it. And everywhere else I've been banned for life, infinity and beyond.
Right, and this is something I haven't announced yet on the channel, but like Swarthy Immigrant, I've also been banned forever from Twitter last week for a completely different reason, for calling a certain person who I've had a debate with the R word. So I am gone from Twitter forever, and so I've been banned 2 times. I'm not quite going to be able to reach your total, but nor do I really
Well,
care, because I think like since I've been banned, I've been suspended before. Every time it's like you get so much time back on your hands because you're not dealing with the shitty distraction of Twitter and all the people who tweet about every little thing. So I am actually, maybe it's not the best thing for my material and my content, but I certainly am not sad to be banned from Twitter.
well, yeah, I totally get where you're. Unlike you, I had a lot of free time on my hand. America's been very, very good to me. If I can quote that old Saturday Night Live line, America was very good to me. So I had plenty of free time at work and at home. I was going through a bout of insomnia. I have a little bit of a insomnia in me, so I would stay up like late at night, and instead of playing video games, I would went on Twitter. It actually, I will say this, it allowed me to play video games again at night rather than being on Twitter. That was the thing I sacrificed most. Is my late night video game playing became my late night Twitter uh, uh, playing, and I viewed it as that way. I viewed it as a something that was immaterial, fun. But my weakness was going after Twitter blue checks, and the one of the things I found hilarious as a studier of human reactions is it looks like glitter. I call them glitters, Twitter blue checks. Um, they have a sort of a checklist of counterpoints. If you bring up something, they'll call you a racist or whatever. But when I tell them I'm an immigrant or whatever, they had no reaction to it other than to say I'm a liar or a Russian or a bot or whatever.
Well,
Because once you
it's funny you bring that up, because the main like I'm not a journalist. I've been, just uh, I do a lot of writing and blogging, but the first story that I ever published as sort of a journalism story related to exactly the situation you're talking about, which was this quote unquote activist in San Diego who was a mole for the David Brock organization within the Bernie Sanders campaign, and he was able to smear a number of his acquaintances who were actual volunteers for Sanders and get them. Two of them were actually named on this Rachel Maddow segment as Russian or Albanian trolls.
right,
And
right.
yeah, so I've been trying to get that published, and I'm still trying since 2018. And it's sort of, I mean, it's different for me because I was a Rand Paul supporter. I traditionally do come from the libertarian side. Even back in 2008, when I was still living in Israel, I'd just gotten out of the army. I'd been, following the Ron Paul presidential campaign. It was almost like hearing, this phoenix rise from nowhere, saying something you'd never heard before about the fact that we just have troops overseas everywhere. And so for me to be defending people who were supporters of Bernie Sanders, who I've always hated, I find him to be just like rat poison in a suit. So it was really difficult for me to accept that now I'm communicating with these people. I had to understand that in the end, it's not just the fact that the media hates people who are libertarian or conservative. They hate people who are deviating in any way from the official narrative, even if they are in many cases socialists and Bernie Sanders supporters. And it's been really frustrating to see that most outlets don't want to publish anything that goes against this narrative unless it does serve their agenda. So it's been difficult because conservatives don't really want to have to defend these Bernie supporters. Obviously, if I wanted to get it published by a mainstream publication, they'd be like, what's the point? You see what happened just last week with the Epstein revelation, and they fired that staffer at CBS who'd been at ABC,
Yeah.
who apparently was leaking it from ABC. So, I personally, I think that I don't fit into any of the camps. A lot of my values are libertarian, especially when it comes to civil liberties and due process and things like that. I've had to defend people that are, they don't have any common beliefs with me, like Tavis Smiley, because they were Me Too, things like that. So, it's a really difficult time to be someone who is for free speech. I mean, just now I've been fighting with these people who are followers of this other guy, this the guy who I ended up calling the R word on Twitter, because they seem to think that they have an argument when they just come onto my YouTube video and just they say, "Oh, I hope I get to see the day that you all die," and shit like that. So, I never censor their comments. Sometimes though they seem to disappear, and I want to even reply to them, but it looks like YouTube seems to be censoring comments of people. So yeah, it's a really strange time.
Oh, I totally. Yes, on the YouTube censoring comments. I was commenting on. There's a YouTuber that used to be a Twitter guy. It used to be on Gab. I think it goes by Diddy Mouse, and I would comment. He actually read. If you guys look him up, he has a Swarthy manifesto that he read out back when I was still on Twitter. I wrote this on Twitter, and he read out my thing. And when I would respond back to him, I noticed that my comments to him were deleted from either deleted or somehow hidden from Twitter or whatnot. So I saw this a year ago with Google getting rid of YouTube comments. There's totally one of the reasons I kind of noticed. I kind of knew this ahead of time. That's why I never told people my name. I always came up under an alias. I would tell people use an alias, do not use your real name, because what happened to that ABC/CBS employee is something I knew was very much in play. These media people, they're scumbags. They're the worst of the worst. They're not free speech anything. If anything, they use our civil rights to attack us with them. They use it as a shield to protect themselves, but they don't make sure that those counter values apply to other people. So that was the reason I knew that they were going to dox people. And then we see the famous case of CNN actively looking for somebody who made a meme against them to dox them as a punishment. You know,
Oh,
um,
that thing, the CNN blackmail thing, the video that I made about that, it wasn't even a good video at all, and it's still to this day the most viewed video on my channel because that was a Streisand effect in live action. Like they were trying to get this dude and trying to drag him out and basically publicly put him in the stocks and hang him if he didn't apologize. And
yeah, yeah.
and in the end it just backfired on them. And by the way, that was the time I really started to write, and I don't share the articles anymore because they were using, they were at a time I was using like something closer to my identity. So, but I was starting to write articles against the ADL because so I'm Jewish, and I was like, the ADL is actually doing the most to encourage people to hold anti-Semitic beliefs, because the more you try to hide something and the more you try to tell people, point at something and say, "Oh, this is dangerous," just like when remember when you were a kid, your parents would tell you don't play with firecrackers, don't play with matches. Of course you're gonna play with that shit because it gets like a mystique that, oh, this is the dangerous shit that we don't get to play with.
You
So
know,
it's
um,
yeah, go
I,
ahead.
I agree with you 100%. Actually, I just linked to everyone in the room. I just linked the Swarthy Immigrant Manifesto that Dina Mouse read out. So if you guys are interested, you can click on that. And I apologize for not paying attention to the scrolls. I do look at it, but I'm not used to chatting and looking at scrolls at the same time. So please, look at that. It's called A Swarthy Immigrants Manifesto. It's by Didimouse Some Did. Some he did. Just look it up. You should find. Yeah. Actually, I'll actually send the link to you, and then you can put it in. Yeah. And this was from 2017, November 2000. They always ban me in November, so this is about the time I was banned. One of the times from Twitter. So um, you know, it's interesting. The other thing that's you called yourself a conservative and whatnot. I am. I always call myself anti-establishment. I guess it's the same thing as a libertarian per se, with some differences. Like Rand Paul, I love Rand Paul to death, and his father to death. I found nothing wrong with any of their policies, except Rand Paul. Again, because he's a libertarian, I totally respect his position and all positions. Is he was for. Well, I think it was during the debates. He would still defend NAFTA. He would still defend free trade because, of course, libertarians are for no government restrictions whatsoever, including in trade, but including in open borders. So I thought that was a deficiency on Rand Paul and the Republicans' part. I recall during, I think it was in Texas, but I don't know what city, in Dallas or where it was held. But Ted Cruz, when he was arguing against Donald Trump, he was saying that he was saying that Donald Trump not supporting free trade with China was wrong because it would increase the cost of diapers to babies because Chinese made diapers are cheaper. And I would watch this and I'm like tearing my hair out. I'm like, Republicans, what the fuck is wrong with you people? You're losing. It was like a disconnect between the establishment Republicans and the Republican base. No one in the Republican base is for open borders or free trade. No one in the Democratic base, again, before Trump won and they lost their mind, was for free trade and open borders. The establishment is, but if you ask a Democrat, do you want immigrants to come and compete with your jobs? They're going to say no. You know, so it was this thing where I was watching in real time. Donald Trump took a little bit on the left. He took a little bit from the right. He took a little bit from the alt parties, the alternative parties, and he combined it all into this pastiche of an ideology. And I go, finally, in Donald Trump, I have somebody who actually uh, believes what I believe in terms of politics. He's against wars overseas. He's against intervention. You know, um, God love the Muslims, but there's something wrong with these people, these Muslims. And free trade is killing us. I'm like, he hit the trifecta for me. So that's when I kind of switched over and I go, you know what? I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I am a Trump supporter. I am a deplorable, whatever you want to call it. Because what he's saying, even though he's ineffective at it, maybe it's bullshit. I don't know, but at least he's saying it. Bernie will talk about the Cox being for open borders so they can bring in free cheap labor, but then uh, but then he cooks on us and he changes his mind. Now he's for open borders because he got pushback from Twitter, some shit like that. Trump was the only one who stood by. Even today, like one of the I apologize for yelling, guys. I lost hearing in one ear about a couple of years ago, so my volume level sometimes is louder than it should be. But Trump, the Democrats are looking to get at Trump. All my life I thought one of the things that was good about the Democrats is they were against these overseas wars. They were against sales to regimes that were, arms sales to regimes that were considered bad for human rights. Remember, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember the 1980s, but the Democrats almost impeached Ronald Reagan because he was selling arms to right-wing death squads in the Nicaragua area, the Contras and whatnot.
Yeah,
Now you have,
Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala.
yeah, now
Yeah.
you have Democrats wanting to impeach a Republican president for not selling arms to right-wing death squads in the Ukraine, who are active neo-Nazis. These are the people. The Nazis wiped out my fucking family. I think my father and two uncles were the only remaining people left alive after the Nazis ran through northern Greece. My mother's side of the family were lucky because the Italians occupied their island in Greece. My father's side was occupied by the Nazis. So uh, the Ukraine is an example. Before Trump ran for president, the Democrats were against not the establishment, but you would get a lot of things like there's something wrong with these Ukrainian rebels that are, yeah, the Russians are bad, but the Ukrainians are a little bit Nazi-ish. And then as Trump wins, it's like we're going to impeach Trump for not wanting to sell arms to Nazis. I find that insane to me, literally insane. Like the world is upside down, and no one points this out. This omission of truth is what I really find the most disturbing about the mainstream press. Uh, when they talk about facts, like for example, the conspiracy theory that Trump is a Russian agent, right? Well, whenever they used to talk about it, they never said it was an unproven conspiracy theory. Now, whenever they talk about Trump saying that the Ukraine is linked to somehow smearing Trump as a Russian agent, um, it's always prefaced by the anti-Trump press as Trump is spreading, unproven conspiracy theories. You see how that works? You see how what they do? If you notice stuff like that, it's sort of like getting the red pill. If you
Well,
can skip,
yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think it's a very broad phenomenon, and especially me coming from the Jewish community, like yourself, my dad's family my mom's family was from Iraq, so it wasn't as bad during the Holocaust because it wasn't occupied by the Germans. There was just a pro-German government, but my dad's family was virtually wiped out in Ukraine, and my grandpa actually had to flee to the Soviet Union and work there as, quote unquote, a soldier, but really a slave laborer in a logging camp until the end of the war. And then my grandma had to hide out over there. And then, I actually, this is something that I've been thinking about writing about a little more. It's that the Holocaust happened in the 40s, and obviously I don't want people to, bury the whole topic entirely, but I don't believe that we should be continuing to hold this above people's head. I have friends who are Ukrainians who live here, and my personal perspective is I'm not going to blame someone for what their grandparents did, but this issue of Ukraine today is an issue of can the U.S. actually improve the situation there for the people? Maybe, but I don't think it's going to improve by us trying to foment more and more conflict with Russia. I think that the best way we can contribute is by mediating between parties and instead of just taking one side. And specifically with this whole issue of using racism or anti-Semitism as a way of driving a wedge between voters. It's very, very interesting. On the left they'll try to paint. In many cases, they'll even paint Netanyahu as an anti-Semite. There was, and I'm not a supporter of Netanyahu, but there was a writer who got fired by, I think it was the New York Post, or it wasn't the New York Post, but her name was Talia Levin, and she was the one who called the ICE agent a Nazi because he had a Maltese cross on his elbow, if you remember that.
yes.
And she got canned for it, and the guy was a paraplegic veteran. And then about a year or so later, he starts calling Netanyahu an anti-Semite because he was trying. She was claiming that she was claiming that he was trying to eliminate the diaspora Jewish identity. It's really funny. Like it's funny if you know it from the Jewish community perspective. But I was shocked how many people agree with her who happen to be Jewish, and it's amazing. And this is why I guess I've been remaining on the libertarian side on many issues, because when we see identitarians in the black community, Mexican community, white identitarians today, Jewish identitarians, and uh, they're all calling out other people for wrongs that were visited on other people that lived before them, but they don't actually want to live in harmony with anyone else. They just want to feel bad about something that happened to someone that they probably never met, who lived 60 or 70 years ago, which it's fine, but you shouldn't be using it in order to get leverage over other people. So
You
it's
know,
an unpopular position that I'm taking.
it's not unpopular. I'll tell you this from my perspective as an immigrant. Um, um, I come to the United States. One of the things I remember, I actually read the textbooks on this. Going through school and whatnot. One of the things as your responsibility as an immigrant to do is you have to subsume your original ethnic identity and all that baggage that comes with it to become an American. For example, my parents are refugees from Anatolia, which is now Turkey. They were genocided out of there, and they had to flee for their lives to Greece. You know, one of the things I told on Twitter is not only am I an immigrant, I'm a refugee several times over. My grandparents were refugees. My father was a refugee, and since I was fleeing a coup collapse in Greece, I'm a refugee. So in other words, my grandparents were chased out of the country. My parents were chased out of the country. I was chased out of the country. So it's like a catastrophe going back 3 generations or more. But one of the things you have to do as an immigrant when you come to the United States, it's a responsibility actually, is you have to give give away. I don't want the United States to go to war with Turkey. I would love it. Oh my God, I would cheer for it. But I'm not here to get the United States on Greece's side so they can um, carry out my vendetta against the Turks, if you will. Just like somebody who's French doesn't want the United States to carry out a vendetta against the Anglo Saxons or the Germans or whatever. You come to the United States, you have to leave your baggage behind. One of the things that people said is a blessing and a curse in America is Americans don't remember history. That's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because you leave behind all that enmity, all that anger and ethnic hatred and whatnot when you come to the new world. All those old grudges go away. You're not supposed to be, if you're Irish, you don't want the United States, even if we had cases of the Irish in Boston supporting the IRA. But if you're Irish and you come to the United States, you don't want the United States to be anti um, British or something, just because of what your people went through under the British rule with the famine and whatnot. So that's sort of one of the responsibilities of an immigrant. Is you come here, you have, and that was part of the assimilation process, which the Democrats, to my horror, and if you that link you link to sort of kind of explains that. To my horror, they don't want a melting pot. They don't want anything anymore. They want us all to live in Balkan ghettos, like balkanization. They want us all not to you're a Jewish American. You're not supposed to somehow interact with other Americans. There was Linda Sarsour. In her famous speech where she said jihad, and people concentrated on jihad, and they didn't concentrate on the part I found offensive because she used jihad in the term of struggle. She was trolling when she said jihad, but everyone ignored the part where she said that her ethnic group should not assimilate. She didn't want her people, her Palestinians, to assimilate. Assimilation does not mean you lose your religion. It doesn't mean that you stop being what you are at home. I still speak Greek at home. I watch the Greek news. When I'm out in the business world, when I'm out in the community, I'm an American. I speak in English. I don't expect someone to start speaking in Greek to me. I don't expect street signs to be in Greek to me. You know, um, which is what we're seeing now, and that doesn't lead to anything good. You talk about like holding people accountable for what they did, what their grandparents did, etc. Granted, that's absolutely true. You should not do that in the United States. If I'm in Greece, though, if I live in Greece, I'm not going to forget what the Turkish people did to my people. I'm not going to excuse what the German people did to my family because I'm in Greece. It's actually something that's relevant to me living in that overseas country. But if I'm in America, I am not going to insist that the United States carry out my personal ethnic grudges against other countries. And that's why I'm not pro-Russian in that I don't want the United States to help the Ukraine. I don't want to get involved in foreign policy conflicts at all. I don't want to arm the Ukraine, and I don't want to excuse what the Russians did. I just don't want to get involved in that. I think it makes it worse. The trend before Trump is we don't do diplomacy. The Americans don't do diplomacy because we're the world hyperpower now. We won the Cold War. We're going to do whatever the fuck we want, and we're going to arm instead of how dare you? We're not going to even carry out diplomacy with you because diplomacy is between equals, and we don't consider ourselves the equal of any other country. It was an arrogant foreign policy, and if you think I'm making that up, George Bush Jr. He ran, he ran on. Remember when he was running he said he wants a humble foreign policy because what the Democrats were doing beforehand was something that was like the American imperialism, and Bush, like I think he took a page from what Trump was going to do later on, and he said that we're going to carry out a humble foreign policy. I took that as a hint that we were not going to do interventionism and whatnot. But then, of course, 9/11 happened, and George Bush listened to the neocons, and then that gave us Iraq, Iran, and then Libya by Obama and whatnot. The Ukraine overthrow of a government that started war with a nuclear hyperpower. I thought the entire point of American diplomacy was we were not supposed to get into shooting war with Russia. But the neocons and the people that hate Trump, they're pushing us into a position where the only way we can confront Russia is not through diplomacy, but through force of arms, through proxy wars, and that leads to what? World War III, nuclear exchange somehow? I don't know. That's a dangerous position. So again, as somebody who's not a Republican, as somebody who should not support Trump, I find myself supporting Trump because he's the peace candidate. He's the candidate for diplomacy. As crazy as that sounds, the Democrats and the never Trump Republicans are the party of war and the party of interventionism and all the stuff I hated as a quote unquote leftist leaning independent. All the stuff I hated about the Republicans is what the anti-Trumpers are now, and the Democrat or Republican both,
Right, and I had to deal with that too, especially there's a lot of neocons who I know who they're from the Ben Shapiro school, and they were very much in favor of airstrikes on Iran and airstrikes on Syria and every time I talk to them, I say, look, we can all have opinions, but the majority of you guys are beyond the age of enlisting in the army or in the Air Force or wherever. You're not going to have to deal with the repercussions of that war. So I guess that's sort of it's not always fair. Obviously, it's not as if only people who are serving in the military should be able to comment on national security and on war. But the fact is that if you take his case, for example, Ben Shapiro, he's actually a little younger than me. And he never took the opportunity. He never volunteered for the army back when the U.S. was going into Iraq and Afghanistan. He's so big into Zionism, but he never volunteered to go to the Israeli army. And yet he seems to be able to, despite the fact that he's never been in practice as anything besides an op-ed writer, he seems to think that whenever he sees fit, the U.S. should go to war with any of these countries. It's a completely biased position, and that's why I think partially this whole Groyper war is breaking out, because there's a lot of people who think that even though they themselves won't throw any of their own chips down on the table for this big wager of a war against a country like Iran, which does have a pretty good military. It's not the greatest military in the world, but we would have a lot of casualties if there was a war with Iran. So he seems to think, well, it has to be a moral position. No, the military strategy is you can be moral and and be in the military, but military strategy has nothing to do with morality. It's very much about being able to take advantage of your equipment, of your intelligence, of the type of geographic advantages that you have. Morality is a very it's not even a secondary concern there. So when he goes and tries to bully people into supporting those wars, I just get like really nauseous about it. I can't stand the guy. A lot of people that I know are huge fans of his, huge fans of these neocons, and it really is. I have to end up agreeing with people who I don't agree with on anything
Yep.
else about it. It's
Yes.
it's
Yes.
retarded.
You
Sorry,
know.
it's R worded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, have you ever heard of a writer called the War Nerd? Uh, uh, he's a I don't know how to classify him, but he talks about war from from a like a alt out of the box perspective. I was going to say alt perspective, but out of the box perspective. and he said that the time to have, Jimmy Carter. This is going off on a little on a tangent, but the last wasted opportunity that we had to change the Iranian trajectory was when the Iranian hostage crisis happened. Uh, if Carter had asked Congress for a declaration of war and invaded Iran, etc., he would have gotten it, but he decided not to, and that was the last opportunity we had to use military force to overthrow the Iranians. What we did afterwards in the United States, it was Byzantine. I applaud him for adopting Byzantine strategy, and but it was Machiavellian. We armed Saddam Hussein to take on Iran, and we used Saddam Hussein to bleed Iran, and vice versa, uh, and that turned around and bit us in the ass. If we go in now to Iran, and I'm not a fan of the Iranian regime whatsoever, but I tell people from my perspective as a Greek Orthodox who's close to the Armenian community, Iran's by law, because they're a Shia people, they're not a Sunni Muslim people. Um, Even though it's not great living in Iran, and I'm not a fan of it whatsoever. I have to always preface this. If I'm a Christian, I'd rather live in Iran. If I'm a Jew, I'd rather live in Iran than live. I actually live here in Bayside, Queens. There's a huge Iranian Jewish community, so I see them on the train every day and have these discussions with them. Um, um, it's better if you're an Iranian Jew or Iranian Christian to live in Iran than it is to live in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is our great ally, and Iran is our great enemy. And I understand why geopolitically why that is, but I don't want to, because of what I think happened a long time ago with the Iran hostage thing. The United States has never been able to fully recover any sort of identity with the Iranians. They hate us. The Iranian regime hates us. And we hate them back. And there's no, as somebody who's an outsider, I totally get the hate, but I think the military solution is long ago past us. There's a whole generation of Iranians that grew up that they may not hate America like their parents did or their grandparents did, but they're not going to allow the United States to overthrow their country. They might join a war to stop. In other words, somebody who would protest the Iranian regime now, uh, I think if we invade or attack Iran, would rise up and try to kill Americans, even though they don't want to support the Iranian regime. So it's one of those things where I don't know how um, orchestrated these uprisings were happening in Iran, like when Obama was president. I don't know if the CIA was responsible because we don't get the full news here. But the best way to do stuff like that is through diplomacy. That does not mean we have to trade with Iran, but we don't have to threaten them with war. If we see that they're attacking ships on the ocean, we should stop them from doing that, of course. But the neocon solution is to invade, occupy, and nation build, which I think is insane. Whatever happened to gunboat diplomacy, which sounds like old-fashioned 19th century shit. But keep your ships, keep your show the flag. If the natives get restless, you shoot at them a little bit, but you don't take over the government. You don't invade and occupy. If you think about it, if you guys are history buffs, remember China before in the 19th century, the Boxer Rebellion and whatnot. It was a regime like Iran. The West viewed China under the Ming Dynasty as sort of one of these regimes that was hostile to the West.
Yeah,
And we had
the Manchu, yeah,
the
the
Manchu,
with the Dowager Empress.
yeah,
Yeah.
all that stuff. We had physical presence. We were a little predatory with them, but they weren't easy to deal with. They didn't want to trade with us. They considered us barbarians and whatnot. So the Manchus were, I called them Ming, but I meant Manchus. The Manchu dynasty was kind of what we would have Iran be today. It was a hostile, weird country that we didn't know how to deal with, and we wanted to overthrow them. But you know, other than a few ventures in and out, we didn't occupy China. We didn't. We didn't send. There was some occupation happening, of course. We had some troops presence there. Um, but imagine the insanity of invading China and trying to take it over. And that's sort of what the neocons want us to do with the Middle East.
Well, I mean,
You know,
there's even neocons who would probably support. I think even Max Boot has written pieces where he'd support an actual like hot war with China with eventual
it's,
goal. I mean, some of these people are they're literally out of their mind because they look at it as I'm sorry if I have to quote Roger Waters because I hate the guy, but
yeah,
like the general sitting out with the lines on the map and they move from side to side. So that's the way they look at it. They don't look at it as actual people. And yeah, I mean, you brought it up exactly right. There's a lot of Iranians, not only Jews, but there's a lot of them. I went to college with them. They're usually pretty sensible people, very, very, very ambitious and intelligent, and they often go for. I mean, I was in engineering, so they were doing PhDs. I was doing my master's at the time. So, to say, well, should we welcome them with open arms to this country? Absolutely not. But we shouldn't be going in there and trying to bust a fucking cap in everyone's ass because ultimately we're not creating a safer world that way. We're going to see more and more blowback. The same way we got blowback in Iraq, the same way we actually did get blowback from Yugoslavia when we were, the Kosovo War and all of that.
yeah,
Those things, which I think is pretty similar to what you're talking about, that we
yeah,
decided we'd go in there and figure it out for those dang, South Ruskies or whatever you want to call them. Well, a lot of the people who would have been pro-American if we would have brokered a truce between them and the Croats and the Albanians, they became anti-American because who was the country that was supporting them? It was Russia, because
yeah,
Russia has a social and religious bond with the Serbian people. So it's really an idea that we should look for a foreign policy that does the least harm and does the most to protect our people. I want to shift gears a bit because one of my other viewers and sometimes guests asked a question about Queens. So you said you're from Astoria area. He wanted to
yeah.
know how leftist is that area of Queens?
Well, that's a wrong way to view it. Except maybe today, there's been some demographic shift happening. When I grew up in Long Island City, which is sort of south from Astoria, and then Queen and Astoria, which is more north of us. Um, uh, it was solidly a Democratic place, but working class Democrats. You know what I mean? Uh, um, uh, and they would occasionally vote for a Republican in large numbers. It was I grew up in Greek Astoria, uh, and the Democrat. It was a Democratic Party. It's in the 1960s and 70s is when Astoria started to see an influx of Greek immigrants, but you had other immigrants moving into it. Uh, uh, this is before hipsters were a thing. This is one of the benefits of Astoria is it's 10 to 15 minutes into Manhattan by subway. They have an elevated train system that would go in there. So nowadays, because of the Democrats have destroyed the real estate market in New York City, uh, Manhattan used to be a working class neighborhood area. South of Manhattan. So, there was a North Manhattan, the Upper East Side. That's where the rich people lived. But then if you move down towards Chinatown and Little Italy, that's when the working class neighborhoods were. The Hell's Kitchen was where the Irish were. Uh,
Right,
you
yeah,
know,
the
actually,
Westies.
the West.
Yeah.
I actually had a friend who's in the West Side. I went to his apartment one day, and it was a tenement apartment where they had one bathroom per floor. That was still a thing in the 1970s, where there was one bathroom per floor. In one of these tenements that looked like right out of the 1860s. You know what I mean? That's how it was back then. I had to see it for myself. I was a little kid, and we went there, and I wanted to use the bathroom, and they said it's down the hall. I'm like, what the fuck? That freaked the fuck out of me. But that's how New York used to be. And Astoria was a working class neighborhood. I grew up right now. If you go to Astoria, uh, you know where Shia LaBeouf had his like little performance art thing in front of that camera,
Oh, the
and
"He
that
will not divide us" shit. Yeah.
right in Astoria. I grew up literally a block down from there. My parents' apartment was literally a block down from there, from that museum. But when I was a kid, and it was an abandoned building, it was an abandoned studio, Astoria Studios. There was a lot of abandoned warehouses at the time. But now, if you go there, it's very hipster, very upscale. It's attracting a lot of immigrants from the United States, not from other countries. There, you have people moving in there because it's close to Manhattan, and of course that drives the rents up now. The rents, I lived in a roach-infested apartment that was dirt cheap because no one wanted to live there. Yeah, and Astoria, just to go back to your point, was always a Democratic stronghold. But from my generational perspective, it was the Irish that held the power. I think Crawley, who Ocasio AOC lost to, Crawley lost to AOC. He was one of these from the Irish machine that worked out of Woodside, Queens. And for the longest time, the Democrats gerrymandered the Greek community. They split us apart. They included Astoria, the Greek part, with Southern Bronx, so they could offset our votes. So they would never elect a Greek person into Congress. And then Long Island City, which is the other part of the Greek Astoria community, they linked us to Manhattan, so we would not have, so they could split the Greek vote, so we could never sort of organize and get a Greek person elected. At least that's what the Greek men told me when I was a kid. I was like, they were always complaining. I remember hanging out with my dad while the older generation were at the cafeteria, the coffee shops, and they're discussing politics. And that was the biggest complaint, is that these Democrats, they're gerrymandering us, so we can't get any Greek person elected into Congress, because we're considered, for some reason, they don't like us, maybe because Greece is anti-American. It's felt, if you go to Greece, Greece is one of the most anti-American. Not that they hate Americans, they hate American foreign policy. Places on the planet or whatnot. I was trying. They didn't know why, but it was the Democratic machine. So the Irish started to move away from Astoria. They were cops and firemen and union people, and they were the backbone of the Democratic Party in Astoria. So calling it left is sort of, I don't know how accurate that is. It was Democrat for sure, but how left is a police officer, how left is a fireman, how left is a electrician, union carpenter. You know what I mean? That's what it was, a blue collar Democrats. It was Reagan Republicans, if you want to use that old term. Um, and what happened is there was a demographic shift. All these Irish guys retired, left. Their kids became college students. They bought houses in Long Island. They moved to New Jersey. They went upstate, Yonkers and whatnot. They went to the suburbs. So suddenly, the backbone of the Democratic Irish, the gerrymandering that the Democrats did to help their Irish community, bit them in the ass, because AOC, being even though she's from the Bronx, she's actually from Yonkers. She was able to ride the demographic wave of Hispanics, being the last major chunk of Democrats still uh, uh, existing in Astoria, and she was able to oust a very powerful Democratic representative. I think he was second in line from Pelosi, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, and
Uh,
I think it's the same. If you go around the country, it's the same issue that a lot of people overseas don't understand. That, uh, like my dad, for example, is exactly the profile that you talk about. He's union. He's been a mechanic his entire life for the county, and he's actually retiring pretty soon. But he would never vote anything not Democrat because for him the Republicans have always been the party of the rich, for eliminating your pension, cutting all the what's it called? I mean, he moved here also. He came from Israel back in the late 70s. So
oh, you and I have the same background then.
yeah, and the thing is, so I was, I always tell him, look, you can think that these people are looking out for your interests, but ultimately they've sold you out just
Yep.
as much as they'll probably sell out some of these other people. They sell out the blacks. They're going to sell out the, who else is there, the Filipinos, whoever. They don't. Once you get into office, you sort of figure out that it's really more about how you spend the cash than it is about who you're spending it for. And what I've seen more and more is that in my area, we have a pretty sizable Jewish community, and there's a few politicians that come from it. But like you said, we still have all the judges here are either Irish, or there's a small group of black judges. All of the prosecutors, most of the mayors and city council members are black or Irish, because every other ethnic group, they usually go into business or into nursing or some other profession. They don't typically go into politics. Now, I guess the younger Irish generations, I think, aren't as strong. So it's almost always the same families of lawyers that end up becoming judges and prosecutors here.
Yeah, well, yeah, Crawley, he was from Woodside. I actually went. I know Woodside very well. I went to a high school that was a few stations away from Woodside. I used to hang out there a lot. I went to Aviation High School. Shout out to my high school from a long time ago, which is sort of like on the 7 train just before you get into Queensboro Plaza. So Aviation High School was just a few stops from Woodside, and my friends were. We had a few friends at Woodside to hang out. There's a every St. Patrick's Day, all the Irish end up in Woodside. It was sort of like the Queens Central hub for the Irish. All the cop bars, all the ones that the cops hang out with, is right there. It's in Woodside, Queens. But that started to, that demographic left. So Crawley got lazy as a Democrat. He was lazy. He thought that on an off-year election that his union base would get out the vote. Unfortunately, he didn't take AOC seriously, and why should he? Because he had the backing of all these institutional Democratic players from the past generation. But there's not that many union members anymore because the jobs are gone. That's sort of the irony of it all. Is you're a Democrat, you're supporting these unions, but all these jobs that the unions are supposed to work at are gone. My parents were in the garment district. Um, uh, uh, that's where they worked, and all these jobs are pretty much gone now. Before Trump ran for president, there's an HBO uh, documentary on the garment district. I think it's called the Shmata Business. I think is the name of the documentary. Shmata is a Yiddish word. It means like rag business.
Yeah, I know well because I've been called a schmata. So
Yeah. So,
it's
so
yeah,
oh, my
it's an insult too. Like if somebody looks like they're dressed like a piece of shit,
yeah.
so like some of these older Jewish people will call you a schmata. So some of them assume you know Yiddish. So
Yeah,
um, it,
ich spreche ein bisschen because I grew up in the garment district, and it was very Yiddish heavy. In fact, one of the first people that helped us along was a Greek Jewish family. Greek that were refugees from the Holocaust themselves, and my parents didn't speak English, but they spoke Greek, and the Yiddish I called them Yiddish, the Greek Jewish family spoke Greek, and then boom, they were able to help my parents. So I'm very in tune with that part of the world because I was speaking. They were speaking Yiddish. I was the babies. They were my babysitters, so they were speaking Yiddish, and I would speak Yiddish back to them. I didn't know. I didn't know better. I didn't go into school until much later. I didn't start. I didn't go to kindergarten. I think I started sometime in late grade school when I started going to once they registered me and everything. That's when I started going into a public school. I didn't speak on an English regular level until maybe junior high school. It took some time. It takes some time to assimilate. The younger you are, the easier it is for you to pick up. Uh,
I guess so. We've talked a lot about like the experience of being an immigrant and the issue of being censored now. Obviously you've been censored much more heavily than I have. And you you coming from Greece, is there like a heavy degree of censorship now there because of the new EU laws, the Article 13? There was just an election there where they swept out Syriza, but
Yeah.
the new group is very very, they cuck to the EU, very
Yes.
New Democracy, I think they're called.
Yes.
So
Well,
obviously it might be a little better in some ways because they're not socialist morons, but how much better would that be, and how does it affect the freedom of speech there?
uh, Greece is not heavy into the internet as other countries. They're a little behind that. So there's not a lot of censorship doesn't work there. Since no one's on the internet that much, except the younger generation, it doesn't really impact them. Greece is one of those countries where if you go, there's like a dozen newspapers per newsstand. Each political party has their own newspaper. You know, there's dozens of newspapers, so it's still a newspaper heavy country. So the censorship really doesn't apply there like it does in the Western European American world, where you're censored online. Just it's not a big deal there. So it's still sort of the old way of doing politics, where you have to take radio ads, you have to do TV ads and whatnot. So newspapers are still sort of the main thrust of any sort of political discussion there. So there's not a lot of grassroots, like where you see the people rising up against the establishment in terms of creating a third. People like you and me and Lennon. Hey, Lennon! Shout out to my friend out there in the chat room.
Shout out
It's
to the
not
top bro, Lennon. Press
Yeah, yeah, hey,
F for respects, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
Good.
it's not like it doesn't exist where we have this sort of anti-establishment view where we're saying, listen, there's something wrong with the Democrats and the Republicans, even though we're supporting the Republicans now because of Trump. There's something wrong with this ideology that they're pushing us with free trade and whatever, and we reject it. That doesn't really exist in Greece so much. I think it's still all top down. There's still sort of like a top down discussion. We don't hear too much from the base. Once in a while, you have like a mass protest happening. But to your point, you're correct. Even though the Syriza, which was the far left, far left, I mean it was a coalition of Marxists, Leninists, Trotskyite parties. Greece has a communist party called Kappa Kappa Epsilon, which KKE, which is actually a Stalinist party. They have Stalin's portrait in the party headquarters. So it's an old I don't even know what to call it.
Unreconstructed. Yeah.
Unreconstructed. It's
Yeah.
an old unreconstructed communist party, and sort of like the third or fourth largest party in Greece. And Syriza was composed of people who were communists, but they're not Stalinists. And it was composed of socialists. It was composed of these little socialist parties. It was composed of Trotskyites, who are deadly enemies of Stalinists for some reason. I could never figure out why.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I could actually, relate. I can actually go into that a little, like
Oh, I
the
know why. I mean, I know why. It just doesn't. It's like the argument between a Greek Orthodox and a Catholic. It
right.
makes
Yeah.
it makes sense to me, but it doesn't make any. Oh, icons
Well,
versus statues. What are you fucking crazy? What the fuck is the difference? But that I know the difference, but like if you're an outsider, it seems ridiculous. Why? But you go ahead. You can tell people the difference between a Trotskyite and a Stalinist.
yeah, I think most people will look at them, and in reality, there's not a ton of difference. But once the Russian Civil War was over, Trotsky was trying to encourage Lenin, Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union, to expand the revolution beyond the borders of Russia. And a lot of the others who were mostly gathered around Stalin said, well, we should really just focus on rebuilding the country first, and then maybe later we'll engage in international communism. And eventually Stalin outmaneuvered Trotsky, and they were both people have this misconception that Stalin was much worse than Trotsky because he killed a lot of Trotsky's followers, but in reality they both were like bloodthirsty tyrants. They would have
Yeah.
killed as many people as they could. It just happened to be that Trotsky lost out and he had to go into exile. But the Trotskyism in the contemporary sense, you can see actually in countries like Britain. You see these organizations. If you look at, I did a video on my book review of the Jeremy Corbyn biography a couple months ago. By the way, I have to make another one because I just read another book about him. But um, a Trotskyist nowadays will do this. They will try to create this inner core of activists and take over a larger organization, like for example, the Democratic Party, but in Britain it's the Labour Party, and they will basically work as a bloc and try to get as many votes as possible and take control of institutions. And once they control those institutions, then they eliminate democracy. So they take advantage of the democratic process in order to implement their vision of the organization and then later society and create a totalitarian people's dictatorship. The Stalinists will usually they will in many ways mirror what happened over in Russia, which is to overthrow the existing regime violently, like the Bolshevik Revolution, and then purge everyone as violently as possible immediately. So they sort of bypass democracy. They go into the most direct way of doing it. And I guess the logical extreme of that would be a country like Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge, or even Albania during the Cold
Hoaxa,
War. Yeah, is it Hoxha or
hoaxa.
Hoxha? Yeah. So there are a lot of countries that still have branches of their communist party that have broken away and they're Stalinist. India has a Maoist wing. I think Arjun, who's in the chat, has talked about it. Peru has a Maoist wing. So yeah, that's pretty consistent. So you have these idiots who all believe in the same bad idea. They just can't agree on how to implement it,
Right.
on how to take the power. It's pretty funny sometimes. That's why these
Well,
democratic socialists, they're in many ways they're sort of a mild form of Trotskyists.
yeah, to me, if you have a historical perspective on it, it totally makes you kind of see this as a religious thing. If you view communism as a religion, even though they're atheists, if you view the way its doctrine is like a religion, then all these sort of little breakouts of these sort of Trotskyite versus Marxist versus Leninist versus Stalinist, it kind of resembles the way Christianity when it arose. You had Paulists. If you go back in time before the Protestants, you had the Arbogensians, the Bogomils. You have all these sort of like offshoots of Christianity that broke off. That
The
um,
Gnostics.
Gnostics, whatever.
Yeah.
It's and then if you read it from a outsider perspective, you don't understand the difference. Like, what's the big deal? Of that little difference is like, one of the big deals between Orthodox Christians and Latin Catholics is the filioque clause. The Latins have a clause where the Holy Spirit goes through the Father and the Son. And the Greeks find that offensive because they added that to the Latin translation of the Greek original. And how dare you change the original because it changes the structure of the Holy Trinity? We're going to kill you. We're going to have a war against each other because of that clause. It actually never turned out into a war. But it was one of the reasons why there's a schism between the Orthodox East and the Latin West. Is the filioque clause. Now, if you look at the filioque clause, it's if you're not a Christian or if you're a Protestant or if you're somebody who's not that into religion, it makes no sense why such enmity exists over this minor little wording. But I see that in communist ideology, some sort of minor Maoist. Mao's big thing is, if I recall, he Marxist Leninism thought was that the revolution would happen in capitalist-run cities. It was the urban population that was going to become communist, and the peasants were not. The peasants were considered sort of like a detriment to the revolution. Mao's take on it was the opposite. It was a peasant-up revolution. Marxist was not supposed to be a revolution by the peasants. It was supposed to be by sophisticated urbanites. People live in cities, they work in factories. That's who was supposed to be the vanguard of the communist revolution. And Mao came along and said, no, it's a peasant revolution, because China was obviously not an industrialized nation at the time. Um, and so that kind of was a flip of the communist ideology, which was also very controversial at the time. That's why people call themselves Maoist. If you guys ever run into somebody who's calling himself a Maoist, it's his idea is that the revolution will come from the peasant class. We're seeing that in Bolivia. In Bolivia right now, you had a Maoist take over the country, even though they use democratic institutions to do this. His ideology is based on the fact that the peasants, the indigenous populations, rise up against the urban dwellers, to enact a communist revolution. And so obviously there's tension between the urban dwellers and who are not communists because they like working and like eating, and the peasants who want, to take over the country via some sort of Maoist ideology. So it's still in play around the world, even though communism has failed. It's still in play around the world because it's like a religion. It's always a drive to a perfection, some sort of utopia. And utopia can never be achieved anyway. You know.
Right, and I think what's really so funny is, and I've tried to explain it to people who are not communist, because many of them don't really, I mean, they don't see the point of even going in depth into the communist belief system. But what they're doing now is that rather than acknowledge that in real world terms, communism leads to a stunted growth at best for society in terms of the potential for technological and economic development, they try to say, well, it's wrong to continue to use ideas like GDP growth and employment and things like that in order to measure progress, because in reality, those are just expressions of the way that capitalism exploits the worker. And then they try to say, well, we should be talking more about how people have more leisure time, like whether that's why they want to justify 4-day work days. That's why they're trying to promote modern monetary theory, if you've heard about that,
Yes.
in order to say, well, currency is really bogus, money is fake, so why don't we just spend as much of it as we want, and then we can just tell everyone if we want free free sex changes, we'll just pay for it. If we want free um, you know butt plugs for everyone,
Right.
whatever. Yeah, it's all like, who gives a shit?
Well,
We can print the money. The whole notion that scarcity drives it is nonsense. That is the way that they think, and then they say, well, this has nothing to do with what happened in Zimbabwe. It has nothing to do with what happened to Russia in the 90s. Inflation is a huge illusion. That they never want to acknowledge that currency markets do have a little logic to them, even if it's a little difficult to predict them.
um, I'm going to use what you said as a segue into one of your earlier questions about the Greece cooking to the EU with the new right wing government. So right wing is a wrong way to say it, but it's left a right of center government, New Democracy, Nea Demokratia. And then Syriza, which was supposed to be this Marxist Leninist coalition, excluding the communists, including the socialists. PASOK was the socialist government. Uh, Remember that cities have won an election, and then as part of the austerity, they were going to leave the EU monetary system, not the EU, but the EU. They weren't going to use the euro anymore. They were going to revert back to using the drachma, right? Uh, and what happened was the EU put pressure on them, and they dropped that. So you had the cities about to do what you're suggesting. They were going to print money for nothing and just use I could have envisioned and I'm not a fan of the EU. I think Greece should have joined the EU, but never accepted the euro. It should have stayed with the drachma. But once you're in it, you can't come out unless you have some sort of basis for your money to have any value. Uh, and what Syriza was proposing was to print money to pay to get out of debt. In other words, We owe you 1 trillion euros. We'll just pay you in 1 trillion worthless drachmas. 60 trillion worthless drachmas or something. We'll just print money until we pay you off, which is never going to happen anyway because uh, you know, it's impossible. Greece would have died right there and then. Greece should never accepted the euro dollar, but once it was accepted, you can't get out unless you have a gold standard. And Greece doesn't have that much gold to begin with. So cities are cucked, and actually, even though they had an election, a referendum, they had a referendum to say, should we leave the euro and use the drachma? And the people said yes. And then when they were about to do it, the European Union says, you do that, we're going to destroy you. And Greece has no way to fight back on that. So they decided to do the euro. And on top of that, they got hit with even uh, harder sanctions, austerity measures, as they call them. So here comes New Democracy, which is the right idea that we're going to use. We're going to grow out of a recession and a depression. It's the only way you could do it. You have to let companies do business and whatnot. But as you said, they cut to the EU because they have no power. Greece is an occupied country within a larger sphere. There's no way Greece can fight back against the euro or the EU in any capacity. So you had a New Democracy win on the idea that they're going to do something about the illegal immigration that's happening because of the Syrian civil war. So you have all these refugees coming to Greece. They're landing on the islands, and it's almost 6,000 a day or something. I read somewhere it was almost 6,000 a day. So Greece can't absorb that. Most of them don't want to stay in Greece because Greece is poor as shit. They all want to go to Germany or France or the UK. They don't want to stay in Greece. But in the meantime, what are you going to do with them? So cities are ran on this. We're going to do something about these immigrants. Well, they win, and what do they do? They accept the EU idea of taking all these immigrants and spreading them around Greece and putting them in retired military bases. So there you go. So there's no, Greece is one of these countries where we can't really look at it that way because it's no longer an independent country. It is a colony, a subsidiary, a satellite state, I think is the best way to call it, of a much larger power, and that is the EU. And the EU is really Germany um, um, calling the shots. The EU is really the German Empire. I wish people would start calling it that. It's what it is. The way the EU works is the following. The euro works like this. Countries used to print their own money and they had their own criteria for printing money. The way it works with the EU is the countries are given money on a loan, and it comes from a central bank, and those central banks are German banks for the most part. And then they have to pay that money back. They use that money to buy German goods for the most part. So there's never any sort of right then and there. It's a monetary colonialism, if you will. It's a monetary empire, and it's run by the Germans. And then you have, in theory, you have the French and the Italians and who founded the original EU. They're supposed to be equal partners because they're part of the industrialized West that formed the EU early on, the common market. But in the end, Italy couldn't sustain. Germany is this big monster that just sucks in all the other ones. No one can compete with German industry. Again, that's a good thing or a bad thing. No one. The French couldn't. I worked as one of the first jobs I had out of college is I worked for a French steel business. Like the French in the 1990s still owned government-owned steel business. It wasn't doing well; it was losing, but it was a government-subsidized and government-owned business. And one of the first things that happened is when I got on board is they privatized. The EU forced them to privatize. They had to sell off. They had to close capacity. They had to close steel manufacturing plants and whatnot. So the EU, a lot of Americans call it socialist, which drives me a little bit batty. The EU is not socialist. It seems like it's socialist because there's a lot of bureaucracy and regulation, but it's not socialist. They force companies to sell out private. Greece had to sell its national airlines, Olympic Airlines, because it was government owned. They had to privatize it. It went out of business. It couldn't sustain it. So like all these foreign companies like Delta and whatnot came over and took over the Greek airline routes. That's what the EU does. It decentralized. It makes where I'm a little bit socialist is I'm okay with national airlines. I think Israel, for example, is a I have some knowledge of Israel. They have a cargo fleet. I think it's called it starts with a Z. I forget what it's called.
Oh,
Um,
Zim.
Zim, Zim.
Yeah, but they have been privatized, by the way.
They had been, but they started off as not privatized. It was government owned, and they had to do it because no one would do any business with Israel. So they had to create a nationalized cargo system so that would allow Israel to function. I think El Al started off that way too. It was a national airline. There's a lot of national airlines out there. You have to because the free market won't take into account um, certain routes. Certain routes can't sustain a privatized air business. So I'm okay with socialism in certain regards, like the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States. Before you think I'm talking like a socialist, I'm not. Um, the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States exists, and it's a government-owned electric power plant, and it has to exist because that part of the country back then would not sustain an electrical. There wasn't a demand to build electrical capacity in that part of the world. Back in the early part of the 20th century when it was built. You
Right,
know,
but I think the distinction is that there's a such thing as socialism, which is the worker-owned means of production, and then there's state investment in various utilities, which is more what they call in economics Keynesianism.
yes,
People like
yes,
Paul Krugman is Paul Krugman is like the butt buddy of Keynes, even though Keynes is dead.
yeah,
So it's almost as if these like people believe that years and years and years later, all of these institutions need to be public, and in some cases, I'd argue you're correct. I don't think necessarily that we should privatize every single state utility, but we're seeing more and more evidence that the post office, for example, that's a Keynesian institution because there are plenty of private alternatives. You can ship something FedEx, you can ship something UPS. UPS workers get paid pretty decent wages and benefits. FedEx, I think, is a little less good, but the post office operates at a massive loss, and the U.S. is basically paying a premium in order to have these people drive around in their wagons and drop off packages on behalf of Amazon. So it's a debate whether we even need the post office to exist, let alone whether it should be owned by the government. In terms of what happens with these airlines and the way that you're talking about these countries being squeezed, the fact is that the way that you're talking about it with France, for example, they like to keep a lot of things state owned, and they have a very very high income tax, and yet they have certain corporations that enjoy amazing welfare from the government. The Total, for example, which is it's an oil company. I think Total is partially owned by the French government,
yeah,
and they go around the world, and they're basically pieces of shit, just like any oil company. But in France they have this whole phony thing. Oh, we have the Paris Climate Accord, and we're going to reduce emissions and what? No, people are going to use fossil fuels for any function that you don't have a renewable alternative for. It's just a fact. Obviously, if you can find renewables or nuclear, it's a good thing. And France actually does a good thing when they rely a lot on nuclear power. But I would say I don't support these countries that try to make things public utilities. They're talking about doing it to the railways again in Britain if Jeremy Corbyn becomes prime minister. And the reason I'll say that, which I think it's technically possible to have some state utilities work well, but not the way that they're going to do it. What he's talking about is basically making the state utilities a means to milk the treasury for all it's worth in order to pay union employees. So these unions are going to strike all the time, like they did in the 70s in Britain. They're going to bring the country to a standstill. They're going to basically create this massive burden on the public dime, and in their mind it's justified because for them, again, this is them shifting the goalpost of what the goal is. For people who live in the world of business, the goal is to minimize costs and maximize profits. For people who are Marxists, the idea of the cost being a limitation is very, 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 very secondary. If you can build a piece of shit that costs a lot of money and you pay a lot of workers to do it, mission accomplished. It's fine, and that's why if you look at the machinery in countries, if you look at the armaments that come out of the Eastern Bloc, if you look at a lot of the automotives, there a lot of people laugh at the Russian cars, some of which were manufactured with steel frames instead of aluminum. Those are things that are manufactured without the priority of limiting costs, and it's taken a toll, and it does create a toll on the health and well-being of the people who use them. And I'm not going to pretend that every product that we manufacture here is perfect. We have Roundup and all the Monsanto crap and sugary drinks and things like that. There's certainly a price paid for the ills of the free market, but people have the ultimate ability to choose because there's alternatives. Whereas in a system that's socialist or even a system that's Keynesian, in many cases you don't. You get the rate that you get offered by the state. That's it. You don't get to choose between. I mean, I even have different alternatives for my natural gas consumption for my heating. So I only have two options because there's only two operators in the area, but I can decline one and take the other. So I personally, I believe more in libertarian economics. I'd probably concede that there's some exceptions. The free trade issue, I think there's been ample proof in the past 3 years that we couldn't keep doing this ridiculous arrangement where China basically gets to gut our manufacturing, and Mexico also. The arrangement with NAFTA is wrong, but I don't believe that we can go back to the way the country was run in the 30s when they were actually burning crops in order to prevent the price of grain from dipping too low.
You know, yes and no. I agree with you on that. I'll give you an example. You talked about Mexico and NAFTA. People don't remember or don't know this, but the huge influx of Mexicans to the United States happened because of NAFTA, not because we opened the borders, but one of the areas America competes in well, that we dominate in, is food production. A lot of these free trade agreements that the United States does is not really done to benefit manufacturing, but it's done to benefit a very powerful agri business. We forget that, but all these free trade agreements are geared to the United States exporting food, which again is not a bad thing. We like to feed the world, but it's done at the when we dominate in that. And I'll give you an example in Mexico. We even had in the 1990s the Zapatista rebels that rose up, and that happened because, yes, there was some institutional racism among the Mexicans. But what happened is NAFTA comes along, and all these peasant farmers, subsistence farmers, before NAFTA, if you were a Mexican farmer, you could grow enough to feed your family and have a little bit left over because of Mexican government subsidies and whatnot. And there was no competition because it was import tariffs. So prices of food were high. It was kind of, there was a little stress on the. I guess everyone wasn't getting the most healthiest of diets and whatnot. But the peasant farmer was able to sustain his health and his family. Maybe he was even able to hire a worker come crop time, to bring the crop in. Here comes the United States with NAFTA, and our grain is cheaper than anything that the Mexican farmer can grow in corn, and so suddenly farmers don't hire workers anymore. Crop time, they can't afford it. Suddenly, what they're growing is not enough to feed their family. Suddenly, the the second son or the third son or the farmer himself have to come to the United States and look for work because they have to support their family. That was a result of NAFTA and free trade because the United States dominated in terms of food output. Of course, the reverse is manufacturing went to if you're an economist, you see that as a trade-off. Yeah, we do good with the farmers do good, but the factory workers don't do good. The all the jobs for factories are going to migrate to low wage countries. So the trade, to an economist, he sees that as a trade, as a good trade off. It's good for the farmer, but it's bad for the guy that works at the Detroit automotive plant because he lost a job to somebody in Mexico. Same thing with China. We're dominating in China. We're exporting grain. If you look at it, China and Japan and whatnot, they're going through the same problems we have in obesity because they're eating more of an American diet, and it's changing the way their body masses usually are, causing some health problems because they grew up eating a rice diet. So, but the reverse is, of course, all the all the industrial jobs migrate to China because their labor is cheaper. So that's what free trade turned out to be. In theory, I'm for free trade as well. I can't disagree with free trade on a theoretical basis, but in what we have currently at the moment just doesn't work this way. It's not really. Uh, there's no free trade. It's managed trade. As you know,
Right. It was free trade for American corporations in order
yeah,
to, but not for the American consumer. So, or
right.
not for the Chinese consumer, because the Chinese consumer would still have to pay a tariff on, let's say, a Pontiac. That was not that, I mean, Pontiacs are shitty cars, but let's say they wanted to sell Pontiacs over in which they don't exist anymore, but over in China, they still have to pay an import duty and tariffs on them. Um, I think we've almost gone 2 hours, but obviously, I don't know if you are you a YouTube creator too, or are you just
I am not a YouTube creator.
okay?
I was gonna delve into maybe YouTube creating just because once I got banned from Twitter, I wanted to where am I gonna get this shit off my chest? And then I got hit with the acoustic neuroma tumor. I had like surgeries in 2018, and I'm like, the hell with it. And then thankfully for Lennon, I can get shit off my chest by talking to him every Saturday. So if you guys want to listen to me pontificate and just talk for 2 hours. Tune in every Saturday around 11:30 to 12 when we start with Lennon's show.
Yeah,
Um,
Len McCarthy 2.0. He's in the chat.
yeah, he's been banned from Twitter many times as well. For what? I still don't know. We hit his last channel got banned because I did a creepy Joe Biden shtick, and that got banned from Twitter because you can't call Joe Biden creepy or whatever. How dare YouTube tell me who's creepy or not creepy? How dare they regulate what I think of Joe Biden? Why are they in the can for Joe Biden all of a sudden?
Well,
That's an America I don't understand. I don't understand this kind of America.
that's really I mean, we're all being the collateral damage of it because are you keeping up with the? I think with after this we'll probably close, but are you keeping up with this whole Groyper situation
I
at all?
am. I am. I'm supportive of. I love those little froggy things.
The
I love.
Pepes and the
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I love all these mimetic warfare that they're using against the establishment. It just drives them insane. I talked about this with Lenin. They don't. We joke about Democrats not understanding memes and they can't meme or whatever. But you understand, people in power. These people think. I know these people. Up to a point, I know them. They think that they control us through controlling of the official narrative. It's a dictatorship, but instead of having secret police and whatnot, instead of having the East German Stasi, looking into our mail and being informed on by our neighbor, they think they control us not through fear per much. There's fear involved, but they think they control us by controlling the official narrative. CNN, MSNBC, to Fox to a certain degree in terms of neocon wars. They all push a certain narrative that's originating somewhere in the government, or through think tanks that work for the government. That's why they all sound the same. That's why they all read from the same, looks like talking point memos. So anything that challenges the official narrative, which is you.
Talking Points USA.
Yeah. So you, with your channel, is countering the official narrative. Lennon McCarthy 2.0, 1.0, he's challenging the official narrative. Groypers are challenging the official narrative. Memes challenge the official narrative. Trump on Twitter challenges the official narrative. You're not supposed to say NATO. There might be problems with NATO. You're not supposed to have this discussion. NATO is awesome, and anyone who thinks that is a Russian agent. Doesn't think that is a Russian agent. So Twitter, as being again an agent somehow of this military industrial complex, the deep state. We don't know where they're, it seems tentacle-ish. It seems almost like there's tentacles everywhere, connecting everyone to everything. And so it seems a little conspiratorial. But once you kind of stand outside it, it makes sense. Anything that challenges the official narrative of those in charge scares them. They take it seriously. We might laugh at memes, like a funny meme like Islam is right about women, or it's okay to be white. I get the trolling nature of those, but it challenges the official narrative. It drives them insane. That's why they go insane. The NPC thing, the NPC thing was one of the most brilliant memes I've ever saw in terms of counter propaganda, because it rings true, and that causes a stir in those who push the official narrative. So what you're doing, what gropers are doing, what meme welfare people are doing, is challenging the official narrative with counter narratives. And that's sort of we saw it in the Arab Spring uprising. What was the first thing that these restrictive governments did against the people that were uprising? They cut the internet. Erdogan cut the Turkish internet when people were rising up against him. They did it in Egypt and whatnot. And maybe there was good reason to do it. They feared the mob. They feared the Islamic Brotherhood or whatever. But the same thing happened with us. We deplorables, to their eyes, as ridiculous as it sounds, we are the Muslim Brotherhood. If you're we're not Muslim. I'm just saying they view us as these insane outsiders. That's why they called us deplorable. That's why Hillary called us deplorables, and her people understood when she was giving that speech what she meant. We are the people that they don't want in power. We exist as peons, serfs. They don't want us to have any sort of power.
Wait,
And
so
our
let me jump in.
yeah, go
Elron,
ahead.
so did you hear that, Elron Humperdinck? You are the Muslim Brotherhood. You in the chat. I
Yeah,
just wanted
yeah.
to, yeah. Now I want to see his
And,
reaction to that. But yeah,
yeah,
keep going.
we're the equivalent of to their eyes. To their eyes, we are the equivalent of if Trump's election was the Arab Spring, using a simile. If Trump's victory, if Trump winning the presidency was America's version of the Arab Spring uprising, then they view us as the demonstrators in the streets, uh, being the Muslim Brotherhood or something.
Well,
That's
so yeah, I think I agree with you in terms of like the censorship and that issue, but that's really why I guess with the Groypers, I really disagree with of course their a lot of their message. I am, for instance, last week I published a new blog post talking about the case for sunsetting aid to Israel, which I think they would probably agree with me, but and in terms of the gay agenda, I'm certainly against the gay agenda, but I don't think that we should basically put these people put them in closets and dunk them in the ocean, not en masse at least, or I do believe people should have privacy rights, things like that, but when I see the reaction to the Groypers on the part of Charlie Kirk, and even on the part of Seb Gorka, whose show I'd listen to on the way back from work a lot of times, they just don't get it. They don't get the fact that you may not like the questions you're getting, but it's not even there's no way to shut somebody up by calling them an epithet. They call them racists and anti-Semites, which they in some cases they are.
Yeah.
But instead of preparing for the questions and knowing how to respond, they want to call them names. And I've offered to a couple people. I researched the dancing Israelis theory, which these people bring up all the time, and I've come up with a very good case as to why they don't know what the hell they're talking about, and they're making it based on very, very faulty evidence that doesn't even rise to the level of charging someone, let alone convicting them. And usually, when I lay that out to a person who's a believer in the theory, they pivot to something completely different, because when they're confronted with the actual topic and have to defend it and have to sustain it using cited evidence, they don't want to do that work. They think that this is a meme game. And when I take it above that level and I say, hey, I'll talk about this with you, I'm completely fine. I was blocked by at least 7 or 8 people on Twitter for debating with them the dancing Israeli thing by telling them, you know, you're you're ignoring the evidence. This person's pointing the other direction when they were talking about the lighter that was in the photo. Why won't you just address this? And all they'll do is they'll pivot to something else and they'll talk about Gaza or something. I'll be like, 9/11 didn't happen in Gaza. I mean, I thought you wanted to talk about 9/11. And then it's pretty clear at a certain point that has nothing to do with 9/11. So
Oh,
that's
that's what you mean by gropers. Okay,
so
listen.
no, but the Groypers don't only talk; they could talk about other topics too. And I don't think that they should be banned from talking about those
No,
topics.
I
But
don't either.
but
My
yeah, go ahead.
Well, my whole thing about it is I don't know anything. Lennon asked me that about what the Groypers are too, and I go, I don't know anything about these Groypers. Was that Pepe the Frog? I don't know anything about it. Uh,
So
I
the
just find
yeah
I
the
just find it funny. I like the idea that you have this insurgency against the establishment. These guys may be totally wrong in their ideology, but I like the way it ticks off the establishment.
and
That's what
that's why by the way, there's people who I think in principle they probably wouldn't agree with the Groypers at all. Like Amazing Lucas has a huge problem with the gay community being involved in conservatism. Now, I personally I think they have this misconception that conservatism is only limited to Christian conservatives, which is something that is it's a gross exaggeration. Traditionally conservatism had more to do with a lot of ideas like the gold standard and against government regulation back in the during the Gilded Age and stuff like that. It had something to do with Christianity, and in some cases, it would be a Christianity that these people don't agree with. It would, for example, the Protestant work ethic. They were saying, well, the unions don't need to exist because if people really want to be wealthy, they would work hard and deserve to be wealthy rather than demand money for stuff that they don't necessarily want to do. So the Christianity that people are saying, oh, this isn't, it's intrinsic to conservatism that there be Christianity. Well, for one thing, you have to elaborate on that. There's a lot of different ways that Christianity, obviously, there's the family, there's this notion of the place of the genders in the home, what a man does, what a woman does, which isn't always connected to the Bible. It could be connected to certain modes of life that are accepted in Western society, and I have no problem with it. I have no problem with people believing in traditional gender roles. I think that this whole, uh, you know, alphabet groups revolution is ridiculous, and I think that they're correct in calling bullshit on a lot of it. But this is something that they seem to misunderstand. If they want to call America and conservatism this Christian movement, they have to acknowledge, for example, that in the 1800s, a lot of these Roman Catholics were considered completely non-Christian, and in many cases today, this is something Rand Paul broached upon when one of the Groypers confronted him. They were saying, "Well, why do you think that?" He was talking about, I think it was mixed race marriages. Why do you think that that's good for America? And Rand Paul's like, well, I'm old enough to remember that in my family, when a Baptist married a Catholic, that was a big deal. And nowadays, most people don't care about it. It's true. In many cases, people of one Christian denomination didn't consider another one to be Christian. There's still arguments within, Mormons don't consider Catholics to be Christians and vice versa. It's not as simple as they make it out to be. And I've never been one to tell people, if you believe in Christianity, don't listen to my channel. I don't care what you do in your personal life. I don't believe in Christianity. I don't ask you to believe in Judaism. I don't ask you to believe in libertarianism, because that's not what my belief system is about. So it's going to be it's going to be very interesting, because Charlie Kirk and his ilk, they're trying to really dodge the question rather than addressing it, and it's festering and it's causing this. In some cases it's pretty funny, but these unsightly altercations at his events.
Well, that's the thing. The Graper movement is one of the things I'm not following at all because it seems to be an online thing, and I'm banned from Twitter. So there's no way for me to confront it or see it or deal with it. Other than I do notice that there's people who are not in power taking on people who are. I don't want to say Charlie Kirk is in power, but he's an established voice. So whenever somebody who's in the outsider, I'm one of those. Let all these. I'm okay with Twitter existing to allow all these voices to occur because eventually a stupid voice will be shot out and drowned out. But if you start banning people, you're making martyrs. There's an old. I don't know if you're old enough to remember SCTV.
Yeah,
It was
with Rick Moranis.
yeah.
Yeah.
There was this hilarious thing about Russia where they were talking about the Uzbeks, like the Uzbeks are like
Hmm.
the
Yeah,
black sheep
from
of the revolution, and then there's one thing is like we've learned not to make martyrs of our enemies, so leave the Uzbeks alone, that kind of thing. So the Uzbeks are sort of the grapers of the Uzbeks. So the more people you ban, that's what the establishment doesn't get. The more people you start banning, the more it radicalizes people. You understand? These groypers would not exist if it wasn't for the bannings or the there's offensive things in whatever there's like I personally don't think 9/11 was done by the Israelis. I do might maybe think that it was a let it happen on purpose scenario, but that's not that's not a hero there. But Twitter said that they're going to ban people like me or you that sort of question any sort of or don't question any sort of narrative on 9/11. The only narrative on 9/11 that YouTube is saying, if I'm reading their terms of service correctly, is the one that pushes the establishment line. The more the establishment does this, the more people are going to look for alternatives, and the more it radicalizes people. So these gripers, it's a plague of frogs. I think a lot of people. I remember that meme where the Pepe thing was a plague of frogs. That's because you're banning these people. The more you ban them, the more it radicalizes other people. Where like, I wanted to see what he had to say. Why are you banning him? Oh, maybe he has something that's truthful. Rather than people's assumption isn't that they're going to come out and say, "Oh, you banned somebody who should be banned because they're lying or they have an opinion that's stupid." They're going to say, like Alex Jones being banned. Why are you banning Alex Jones? Is it because you find him offensive, or maybe because you don't want people to listen to him? Maybe he has some sort of truth that you don't want to come out. And then, lo and behold, people start gravitating towards the Alex Jones position on stuff. I'm not an Alex Jones fan. I don't think I've ever listened to Alex Jones in my life, but I don't want him banned from Twitter. I don't want his voice silenced. Maybe he has something to contribute. Maybe allowing him to talk will make everyone there say, no, he's full of shit. I'm not going to listen to Alex Jones. But when you ban him, it sounds like you're trying to silence his voice because you're afraid of him. And that gives him strength, he becomes a martyr, and that's where the strength of the martyr comes from. If you want to talk about, I'm an atheist, slash agnostic. I'm not really into religion or whatever, but that's the strength of the martyr. A martyr's strength is you had to kill this person because of what they're believing. Maybe there's some truth in what he's believing that scares the people in the establishment. I hate the establishment. You hate this guy. Maybe because I hate the establishment and you hate this guy, I'm going to gravitate towards his position. And that's
The,
sort of the danger of these Twitter bannings and whatnot.
yeah, and that's why certainly I don't necessarily focus too much on some of these feuds that are on YouTube and Twitter, but like what's going on right now with the Groypers, you see all these people saying ban Fuentes, ban him, he can't be on Twitter or whatever. And I look at it and I'm like, they're giving all the kindling that he needs in order to create a fire. But what if they would have just either A, ignored him, or B, kind of say, well, we'll talk about the issues that you want, if we can set up something, and we don't want to get into some sort of dick measuring contest with you. That would have been the proper approach. Now, what would have happened in the end is what has been happening for a while. He's in some sort of ridiculous feud with Owen Benjamin, who I have no
Right.
way of making sense of any of that. And it's like in the end, people are flawed. They fight with each other over very, very trivial things, like is going on over there, especially in a movement like the white nationalist movement, or I don't know what he calls his movement. I guess you'd say those are the trad cons. But I think that in the end, people have to look beyond just their own desire for what will happen in politics. They have to realize that in many cases, the rest of the country doesn't agree with them. I've been very clear that in some cases, like ideas that I propose, privatizing, for example, public housing would be very unpopular. So, on that note, please let everyone know where they can find you. And I guess we'll close on that. And also, obviously we can find you on Len McCarthy's stream, but do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I'm not anywhere. I'm not on anywhere except on Gab, and
He's
I'm
not
on Gab.
anywhere, but yeah, he's everywhere. He permeates everywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah.
uh, I, I'm I'm banned from any sort of social media whatsoever, well, except on Gab, and which is unfortunate because no one goes on Gab anyway. So, but it's a place I can vent a little bit.
Yeah, everyone
One
join Gab.
Yeah, Gab is not ideal, but it's where I am at the moment. A lot of people say, "Well, come back on Twitter. You had thousands of followers before. You'll get thousands of followers again." And then they ban me again. So I keep doing this sort of like circle of it. So at the moment, that's all. You can find me on Lennon McCartney 2.0 every Saturday. We do sort of like a breakdown of the discussions. I think it's funny. I try to crack him up. He tries to crack me up. And we could do more of this if you want as well. I don't mind talking to anybody on any topic
Yeah, I
whatsoever.
mean, well, we could have both of you on. I've had Lennon on before. Sometimes for some, and he'll agree. Like whenever he's on, we have this weird issue with the connection, and he hears me. I think like 5 seconds after I stop talking or something. So he
I
there.
blame I blame the deep state.
Yeah, the deep state of Sacramento. So
Yeah.
so anyway, with me, you can find me at Chef Leopard on Minds, BitChute, and on Subscribestar for those that do want to donate. Also on Gab at Starscream85. And yes, Swarthy, you're welcome back anytime. Or if you want to, even if you want to send me something to upload, and we could just label it Swarthy's Takes or Swarthy Style in the morning or something. And we could talk about it some other time. But I'm always glad to have people, especially ones that they're all about freedom of expression and the public square. So I'll talk to you later, and here's some more music.
Oh, thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, man.